Hello and welcome to this edition of Google Hangouts, brought to you by the National Crowdfunding Association of Canada. The NCFA is Canada's leading advocate for crowdfunding and is an essential resource for education and networking related to crowdfunding. The NCFA works closely with industry groups, government, academia, and small businesses to create a vibrant and dynamic crowdfunding industry for all of Canada. Today we're going to be talking about crowdlending. We're talking with Tabitha Creighton from InvestNextDoor and Kevin Sandhu from GroupLend. And my name is Gabe Nasser. I'm from Silicon Valley. I'm interning at the NCFA for the summer. And we'll go around and do some introductions.
Hi, my name is Tabitha Creighton, and as Gabe said, I'm the CEO and co-founder of InvestNextDoor. I'm really interested in seeing what we can do to transform access to capital for small businesses, which is what really inspired me to start this business with Lisa Oman, my partner. And hopefully we'll be able to shed some light on what crowdlending is today and how it can work for small businesses.
Yes, thank you, Tabitha. It's good to have you. And then we also have Kevin Sandhu.
Thanks, Gabe. I'm Kevin Sandhu, CEO and founder of GroupLend. We are a development stage and soon to be launching online consumer lending platform. We'll be operating a credit marketplace, so essentially a place for borrowers to come get funded and a place for investors to come and fund those loans.
It's good to have both of you. Thank you for joining us here today. So I think I will direct my first question to you, Tabitha. Tell me about InvestNextDoor and the type of group lending that is conducted on the site.
Sure. So if you think about the whole sphere of the crowd economy, there's three basic ways that you can participate as a consumer or as a small business. And so there's obviously rewards-based crowdfunding that everybody's really familiar with, Indiegogo, Kickstarter, where an individual or a business exchanges a gadget or a reward of some kind in exchange for an individual or a business supporting a project or an initiative that they have. And the objective there is for a very supportive community to help move something forward. The Reading Rainbow being a great example of a great rewards-based crowdfunding campaign that took place on Kickstarter recently. And then you have equity-based crowdfunding. And that's really focused more on businesses who want to sell capital or shares in their company in exchange for monetary investment from investors. And that's more prevalent in the US than it is in Canada. But we're definitely seeing that as a great new path for access to capital. The important thing for businesses to understand is, first of all, they need to be incorporated in order to be able to sell shares. Seems pretty obvious. And then the next thing is that when they go ahead and sell those shares, that now they're accountable to those shareholders for things like dividends and performance. And investors are going to find that it's not a very liquid market the way that it would be in a publicly traded exchange. And then we have the crowdlending space. And within the crowdlending space, there's really two subcategories. There's the peer-to-peer lending space, which is consumer to consumer, or consumer being the borrower in that scenario, and a consumer lending the money, although we're starting to see some institutional support for consumer borrowing. And then we have the crowd lending space, which is focused more specifically around small businesses getting money from the crowd in a borrowing scenario, bypassing traditional financial institutions loaning the money. And so the space that InvestNextDoor plays in is small business crowd lending. So we focus on the average business, the average Main Street organization that wants to borrow money in order to get working capital or refinancing or grow their business in some way and doesn't want to pay the rates that the banks and the direct lenders are paying. So they go directly to people in their community to get that investment.
Well said. Yes, that was a very concise description of most of the different ways crowdfunding is being used right now. A theme I want to weave into this discussion is that of crowdlending in Canada and the challenges that Canada faces as a country that the US doesn't. I know that you are based in Vancouver, but InvestNextDoor, your business, is established in the US. Can you talk a little bit about what it looks like for the future of crowdlending in Canada?
The reason why we situated the business as an American corporation has to do with the regulatory environment that supports the capital access for markets for small businesses. So in the U.S., you're allowed to do this crowdlending concept. You provide an exemption through their securities laws that allowed you to go ahead and get money from the crowd using what's called Form D, which is the form that you need to file at the federal level through either a 505 or a 506 or 504 exemption. Any of those would allow you different scenarios in which you could effectively crowdfund. And Canadian businesses can actually participate in a US-based crowdfunding portal, whether it's Crowdlending or Crowd Equity. Right now, 20% of all private securities issued through the federal government in the US are actually foreign entities, which is really interesting. So Canadian businesses can actually use the US securities marketplace in order to obtain access to capital through crowdlending or through crowd equity funding. Similarly, technically Canadian investors could participate, but the challenge comes in because whichever business is taking money from investors, they need to comply with local securities regulations, both at the federal level and either the state or the provincial level. And that's where it becomes complicated today for Canadian consumer investors. And I think, Kevin, you can probably speak to that in more detail than I can, because I think that's more where you're focused. But we really see that it's the U.S. capital markets have been set up for success to make it much easier, which is why for the time being, we've chosen to locate the company in the U.S. We allow Canadian businesses, but it just makes for a more smooth experience from a capital access perspective.
Okay, so the U.S. makes it easier to gain access to capital. But what are the steps which need to be taken to make it easier for Canada to implement a system that better supports this access to capital, or just in general crowd lending?
The provincial securities commissions here in Canada are definitely looking at how to enable equity-based crowdfunding. They are looking at solutions. They're certainly taking cues from what the SEC is doing. We just haven't got that far along. And one of the challenges is, of course, that in Canada we have provincial securities commissions rather than federal oversight like the SEC, which means that each province right now needs to create their own rules, which creates further complications in terms of being able to access investors outside of your own province. Because if the regulations are different, you have to follow requirements from each province or file for exemptions. I mean, in either case, it's a little bit more complicated than you see in the US. Not impossible, but definitely more complicated. But hopefully we'll see that change soon.
Yeah, hopefully we can figure things out here in Canada. I know things move a little slower here, and it's a little more challenging. But like you said, hopefully things look bright at the end of the tunnel. Kevin, I want to hear a bit about GroupLend, what you guys are up to, and the status of the portal.
Yeah, in a nutshell, I'd echo a lot of what Tabitha said there, that Canada is certainly unique relative to the U.S., probably a few years behind, and unfortunately more complicated. The lack of a national securities regulator might be a real limitation for quite a while. Essentially, we've looked at the problem and said that from a borrower's point of view, there's a lot of benefit to be had from a crowdfunding model. From an investor's point of view, the same applies, but we can break investors into a couple of different buckets, and really one of the simplifying filters is accredited versus non-accredited investors. And so we've designed our model to be sort of as lean as possible to provide the best value possible for consumer borrowers. That's required us to cater to accredited investors, which gets away from traditional crowd lending and all the regulations that go around crowdfunding. Tabitha talked about the equity crowdfunding legislation being proposed and expected fairly soon from majority of the provinces in Canada. A lot of that really doesn't apply to exactly what we're offering. Without getting into the details, our product from the investor side is something that's catered to accredited investors. We have a plan in place of how we can hopefully eventually open that up to a wider base of investors, i.e. accredited investors, but at the same time, I don't think that the equity crowdfunding rules that are proposed and floating around in the industry right now really make sense for the product we're offering either. So we're in this funny situation where we don't quite fit into any of the buckets, and certainly the securities regulators have enough on their plate dealing with the broad concept of crowdfunding, that catering to the very specific niches, ours being one of those niches, is certainly a challenge. So the accredited investor limitation, I wish we could offer it to a wider base of investors, but the benefit of working with that is that there's some components of the regulation. We were able to take advantage of some of those to offer really the best value proposition of borrowers on the other side. Less regulation and cost associated with that on our end is a value we can pass along the chain to our customers.
Okay, great. So talk a little more about GroupLend. The model is based on lending peer-to-peer, but is there room for business lending in the model as well?
Yeah, we're exclusively focused on the consumer lending space. So this is not businesses, not SMEs. We're just lending to individual consumers on the other end. Canadian only focus for the time being, and you know, unlike Tapa's business that's focusing on SMEs, you know, it's a completely different profile of borrower.
So does your model compete with credit cards?
Yeah, that's a pretty good example. I mean, we're offering unsecured loans to personal borrowers, meaning that really they're loans that could be used for any purpose. But an obvious alternative is against credit card debt. If you take a generally prime quality consumers carrying credit card debt anywhere from the high teens to high 20% interest rate, we're hoping to offer them a product that's equally, if not more, convenient to use at a significantly lower cost. So it's one of many uses. You could really use our product or our loan for anything, but that's an obvious point.
That's really interesting because there's this huge system that keeps credit card users in check, what with credit history and credit scores. Is there a similar system set up in your model?
Yeah, it's the nature of unsecured lending. I mean, the fact that it's unsecured means that there's not a particular asset that we can collect in the case of a default. Instead, it's against a person's general credit quality, and to the extent that they are late or defaulting in payments or on the loan entirely, it very significantly affects their credit rating, their ability to borrow in the future, the cost of borrowing across other products that they carry. In that sense, it's not really any different than the credit card world.
Good stuff. Okay, so you mentioned unaccredited investors. Tabitha, is there any plans to integrate unaccredited investors into InvestNextDoor?
So as it stands right now, there are already exemptions that our clients can use to allow up to 35 unaccredited investors to participate. So while we can't take advantage of what I would consider to be a true crowdfunding model where you could see an unlimited number of unaccredited investors, you definitely, even today as a small business, can have up to 35 unaccredited investors participate, which we feel at least is a good stepping stone while we wait for Title III of the Jobs Act to be finalized by the SEC.
Okay, so building on that, at InvestNextDoor, you have this body of accredited investors who participate in these lending campaigns. What are these investors like? Are they investing in addition to their portfolios, or is it replacing other investments they would be making?
Accredited investors, in particular, as high net worth individuals, they're looking for ways to get market rates of return. So we're talking about rates that are between, say, 8 to 15%, and find that in more of a fixed income stream. So this becomes a really great alternative because within the context of fixed income streams, you're really, in the space of things like bonds and treasury bills and dividends. And so getting into 18 to 15% returns are extremely good. We were talking last week, I was in New York meeting with one of the larger institutional platform aggregators, and what they're seeing on the institutional side with family foundations and the high net worth portion is that typically those accredited investors are going for the higher risk profile of investments because they really see that the higher profile, obviously, or higher risk creates a much higher rate of return, and that's really advantageous in what they're looking for. So they like the idea of supporting businesses who otherwise would have real access to capital problems.
Okay, I'm going to switch gears a little here. Kevin, what benefits will GroupLend provide that would make someone who is seeking money or who wants to loan money choose to use your portal?
Yeah, sure. On the borrowing side, to getting money, we think of it in terms of three big buckets. The first is an economic benefit. A GroupLend loan should, at all else be equal, be meaningfully cheaper than a, say, credit card or other traditional bank alternative. So that's it's a pretty clear economic savings. The second is a service or convenience component. Our model is a true online model. You can really access the platform any time of day, any day of the week. There's no such thing as a business hours or business days. And so it's quite convenient for borrowers to use. Our platform is entirely mobile optimized. You can access it from your desktop, your phone, your tablet, whatever's convenient for you, and fill in the application and provide whatever information we need at really your convenience. And then finally, the third bit is really the socially responsible component, and that I think is a running theme across the crowdfunding or even if you boil it down to the crowdlending space. And that's really the idea that by this efficiency we gain by largely disintermediating or reintermediating the middleman with a leaner, more efficient approach of directly connecting investors and borrowers. The byproduct is also that we're shifting some of the economics to both sides of that transaction. So the borrowers is getting that economic benefit, and at the same time the investor is getting an economic benefit through a better risk-adjusted return. And so it's a more socially responsible form of borrowing. So the three categories, and the economic, the service, and the socially responsible. On the investor side, similar idea, but it's really two buckets. One is the economic, again, that's a very attractive risk-adjusted return. Tabitha talked about the fact that these are extremely high return securities considering the risk profile that you face. Particularly in this interest rate environment, we feel that investors are quite yield starved, and that's true for institutions, individuals, whether they're accredited or non-accredited. And so the product that's being offered here is a relatively high yield return for the type of fixed income investment it is. Relatively low volatility, relatively short duration product, and so it's quite an attractive economic proposition. And the second is, again, that social responsibility concept, the fact that your capital is going very directly to specific uses on the other side, to borrowers or consumers that are taking advantage of that capital in a very efficient basis, often to refinance more expensive debt, often to fund new purchases at a more cost-effective basis. But again, the fact that you cut out that expensive and unnecessary middleman, has a both economic and social benefit to both sides.
Good stuff. Okay. Tabitha, can you talk a little about the benefits InvestNextDoor provides? I saw this really cool thing on your website. I'd love to hear you talk about it. And that is this thing about community binding, like a community binding element that's involved with the users of InvestNextDoor. Can you talk a little bit about that?
The benefit for the small businesses to using InvestNextDoor, beyond the fact that it's really easy and it's a one-step process with an application that takes a couple minutes to fill out online, it is really that they're getting not just investors from their community, but they're getting advocates and they're getting ambassadors. So the money that the investor provides to the business is really just the first layer of benefit. What they get beyond that is somebody that understands and believes in and wants that business to succeed, and who's going to feel a sense of affiliation because they've chosen that business out of all of the different businesses that they could have chosen to make that one successful. So what we're also seeing, though, from a specific community, and Kevin touched on this with the theme of social responsibility, is what's the aggregate economic impact of making that community-based investment. So we know that when a business receives money from an investor, every time a business doesn't go to a bank, the interest that they would have paid to the bank goes to that investor, which means that investor gets not only their original amount back, but that extra percent that they can spend again in the community. So that, call it $5,000 that a business borrows plus a 5% interest rate, means that now we've got, an extra $250 that's going back into that community. And when money stays in a community rather than going out to an international franchise, roughly 3 times the amount gets redistributed back into that community. So you get huge accretive benefit between investors and the small businesses when they invest from a community perspective. So we really see what this is doing is the intersection between impact investing and crowd lending, where you can actually say you're making an impact and you're getting a market return.
That is so cool. I love that. So I don't know if you guys have questions for each other, but I would love to hear some, you guys are the experts. I'd love to hear what kind of questions you guys have about this whole model.
Kevin, your business model continues to be a great interest to me. I love that you guys are doing this in Canada. And I know you're just launching, but any plans or opportunities to expose it to the U.S. consumer space, or are you using any particular U.S.-based model that you're going to build off of to adopt it for the Canadian or adapt it for the Canadian market?
Yeah, I think I'd love to be able to offer the product or the service to international customers, U.S. or otherwise. But the reality is, it's an enormous market just in Canada alone. I think we'll have our hands full for at least the next few years domestically. So and secondly, well, this model's new to Canada. It's not necessarily new to the U.S. There are a lot of similar businesses out there servicing customers, and I think that Canadians deserve a similar offering up here. So, I think this is a bit of a first-class problem, but we think we'll have our hands full domestically here and won't be looking internationally. I think sooner than geographic expansion, you would likely see GroupLend moving into other verticals. What I've described is the core product being an unsecured consumer lending product, generally prime quality borrowers. And setting aside the jargon, that's a real niche of a niche of a niche. And I'd love to be able to expand that to a product that caters to super prime borrowers and maybe emerging prime or near prime borrowers. I'd love to be able to expand it to a specific student loan product, even secured lending or SME lending much down the road. So I think that domestically that the credit markets are just so enormous, and there's so much value to be added within Canada that we'll probably continue to focus on this space for at least the foreseeable future. And I guess the questions to Tabitha, I don't really have any questions. We've spoken before, and I think I generally have my head around the model. All I can say is just a huge kudos that the thing that gets me the most excited is the last point you made about the redistribution of that economic benefit within a community is just enormous. I think that it's something that's interestingly it's both scalable and local at the same time. That it's the sweet spot that not many other models or many other industries can share, which I think is great. Can't wait to see more of it here.
Yeah, well, stay tuned. We're about to we're just in the process of creating our social impact index. And so that's going to be really interesting. First of its kind globally. What it'll allow you to do is to rank the relative social impact of either a borrowing that you're doing or an investment that you're making. And that'll be based on characteristics like the accretive nature of what the impact would be to that business, as well as to the investor, as well as to the community. So will it create jobs? Will it create more consumer spending within your community? How is it going to allow the business to actually grow? Does it create more longevity there? That's a big launch for us that we'll see later this year.
Great. So I think we got a lot of good stuff here. Is there any final remarks you guys want to make? You guys really appreciate you guys coming out and chatting with me. Is there any final remarks, Tabitha?
Well, I guess the only thing I'd say is I think in Canada there's so much opportunity here. Canada is made up of lots of little communities, but we still have really, really strong ties to one another. So I'd say that, whether you're a consumer that's looking for a great alternative to the high interest bank loans and a platform like Kevin's makes a lot of sense, or whether you're a small business that's, wants a few more options other than, the big five. Really to start exploring what crowd lending and peer lending can actually do for you. There's just all kinds of goodness that we're going to see coming out of the marketplace, and so to continue to explore.
Yes, I agree. There's a lot of potential here in Canada, and it just needs to get tapped into.
Exactly.
Okay, great. I wish you luck, and to you, Kevin. I also want to thank you both for coming out today and joining in on the conversation. Thank you. Until next time, this is Gabe Nasser for the National Crowdfunding Association of Canada, signing off and wishing you all a happy summer.